Okay, so this is part two of topic 5.0, 1750 to 1900. And this is where we will focus on answering our question, why do historians define 1750 to 1900 as a period in world history? So when we look at this question, why do historians define 1750 to 1900 as a period in world history? We first of all want to identify and describe what this age is about. What are the things that define this as an age? So, obviously, it all revolves around the word modern. Secondly, we need to identify the key dates that define this time period, not just by dates, but what is happening to serve as kind of a transition between past ages and this age and within the age. And then finally, we need to identify and describe the characteristics that define the period. So as you go through this video, you're going to be taking notes. And these notes should focusing on accomplishing these three tasks: identifying the overall idea, identifying the key dates, and finally identifying and describing the characteristics. So when we begin, we have to kind of look at the overall things. The modern age, between 1750 and 1900, historians call this time period the modern age. So it revolves around two general ideas. Idea one is the idea of modern. What is modern? What does it mean? And how does it apply? And secondly, it also revolves around something known as the empiric worldview. Now, you should already know what empiricism is. Now we're going to apply it to kind of how it dominated people's worldview during this time period. So when we talk about modern, we're really saying that these are things that relate to today. So when we put it in the context of history, the modern processes that we use today, and remember, processes are the pieces, okay? The modern processes that we use today to survive and prosper were all developed between 1750 and 1900. For example, when we look at the P, the political, modern governments based in democracy, voting, and republics, well, they found their origin through the Enlightenment and were established by certain revolutions, such as the American and the French Revolution. So by 1900, a majority of the population of the world is using some sort of democratic republic. When we talk about innovations, a majority of the innovations find their origin between 1750 and 1900. The automobile, electricity, plastic, a lot of things that we use on a day-to-day basis all come from this time period. When we talk about the environment, this is the first time that we really exploit our environment, not use it, but exploit it. And so this leads to the fossil fuel revolution that dominates us today. When you talk about culture, well, we're based in a materialistic culture, buying stuff. The person with the most stuff wins. So that's why in the upper right, I essentially got a picture of an aisle in Walmart. Actually, I took that, and then the people down there kind of got mad at me. When you talk about economics, we're talking about big time globalization. And when we talk about social, this is when we're going to begin to preach equality in gender roles, equality between social classes. So the bottom line is the modern age that begins in 1750 and goes to 1900 sees the development of the modern processes or pieces that we use today to survive and prosper. The second thing would be the empiric worldview. So to get you to understand this, I need you to take a look at this picture. And you need to make a decision. Is this a picture of an old lady or a young lady? Press pause right now so you can study it. Okay, welcome back. When you study the picture, the answer's both. And the key is that line that I'm pointing to. When you determine that that is a choker going around the young lady's neck, it looks like a young lady looking over her right shoulder. Okay? But if we say that that's a mouth, then we can say it's an older lady. See, the bottom line is you used your senses to perceive what you saw and to make sense of it. And you came to a conclusion basically on what you observed. So, my hunch, and studies have shown that since you're younger, you were more likely to see the younger woman first, whereas me, being an old man, I see the older woman first. But through some education, hopefully you can see both. This leads us to empiricism. And you know that empiricism basically states that all knowledge comes through the use of the five senses, meaning that any basic beliefs that you have don't come from religion, don't come from tradition. Essentially, what they come from is what you see. So, this is going to be important because during the modern age, people are going to go against tradition. People are going to not abandon religion, but they're going to really go away from it because when you talk about tradition and when you talk about religion, you're talking about faith. And faith is the belief in something that you really can't prove. So, what I'm telling you is that during this age, people developed an empirical worldview, the use of rational thought and observations to gain knowledge about the world and to use it to act. And this is going to be the foundation because this is going to be leading to the new ideas about political systems. It doesn't make sense that a ruler is there by God. It makes better sense that you, me, and everybody else have a voice in government. It doesn't make sense that the weather or an earthquake or something is caused by, a punishment from a god. There's a scientific. So these two things together, okay, the idea of modern and the idea of the empiric worldview are the main ideas that we're working with and are the main defining characteristics of the 1750-1900 time period. Now we got to go through some dates. So when we look at dates during this time period, there's three main dates that you need to know. First off is 1750. And we choose 1750 as the start of the modern age for two reasons. It's the start of what's known as the High Enlightenment. The Enlightenment, as you know, was a time period in which philosophers came up with new ideas about government, economic, and social processes that promoted individualism, that protected rights, and provided for self-determination. The other thing that begins in 1750 is the movement toward industrialization. This is when Britain really begins to proto-industrialize. And if you don't remember what proto-industrialization is, please think back to the Song Dynasty. These are the things that a country takes before the Industrial Revolution. So 1750 is the start date because we see the start of the Enlightenment and we see the start of the Industrial Revolution. Now, by 1850, pretty much the world has become fully industrialized. The Industrial Revolution is spreading. The Enlightenment ideas are spreading. And so states such as China, Japan, Russia, and other areas, they're really beginning to adopt aspects of both of those. But on the flip side, they're not totally abandoning their traditional views. They're trying to integrate these two things in their existing systems because essentially they have to. Also by 1850, this is when Europe begins to dominate the world. So the ending of this time period is 1900. And 1900 is the ending point because by this time, Western industrialized imperial empires basically dominate the world. Trade across the world network is deeper, wider, and much more consistent. And widespread migrations take place across the world. So when you look at what we're doing here, answering the question, why do historians define 1750 to 1900 as a period in world history? We've already identified the overall ideas, and that would be the idea of being modern and the idea of the empiric worldview. We've identified the three key dates and explained why they're important: 1750, 1850, and 1900. Now we're going to get into the characteristics. And to remember these characteristics, we're going to use the acronym of RISING. Now, before you get all hot and bothered, I know that there is a slight misspelling, okay? But I want you to understand each one of these letters represents a key development and a key change during this time period. So as I go down, remember what the R stands for or the I stands for and how it helps define the time period. And also pay attention to where those terms you defined fit in. So when we talk about with R, well, R would be revolutionary. And when you talk about the 1750 to 1900 time period, this is when we see drastic, radical, and total changes in the political, the economic, and the social processes that are designed not to promote the survival of a state, but to promote the individual, their rights, and their self-determination. This is a big change in these three processes. Secondly, when we talk about the I, well, this is where industrialization takes place. And as you know, industrialization is essentially adopting new sources of power, new technology, and new methods to the production of goods. So this idea, which is very profitable for individuals, is going to begin in Britain, spread to the West, and eventually after 1850 is going to spread across the world. And this is going to fundamentally change not only economic systems, but also cultural systems and social systems. But it does lead to some consequences. The S stands for solutions and responses to the consequences of industrialization. So when we look at this, what we're trying to understand here is the Industrial Revolution brought great changes. Not only positive changes, but also negative. For example, when you look at the positive changes, people could have more stuff. Why? Well, because it was cheaper. Also, there was greater wealth available and much more social mobility for people. Negatives, though, focused on the unequal distribution of wealth, the uncontrolled urbanization, because that's where the cities were, and the crime and the pollution that followed, and an overall pollution from the exploitation of the environment. So people began to think up solutions to these. These solutions focused on isms or an ideology aimed to make life better. And one of the main ones that grew out of this was socialism that I introduced in the past video. E stands for environmental exploitation. And this is the first time that we've exploited the environment. Now, the environment has always been used as a source of resources for humans to use for survival and prosperity. But after 1750 and up to 1900, this is where humans really began to exploit it. And it focuses on the fossil fuel revolution, the use of coal, oil, and other fossil fuels that basically were needed for energy to be able to industrialize. New resources such as copper, tin, and rubber were used and resulted in great levels of pollution, but also the beginning of imperial empires that I'll talk about in a minute. I stands for imperial industrial empires, and these Western empires are basically going to dominate the world. So from 1750 to 1900, the West surpasses the East as the center for world political and economic power. In other words, the land empires that we've been talking about since 1200, this is going to be their downfall. And in their place emerge imperial industrial empires. These empires see the use of indirect or direct control by strong Western nations over weaker nations in the Americas, Africa, and Asia to provide resources, places of investments, and markets. This relates to the imperialism that basically you defined. And the Western nations were able to do this because of their great technological advantages. So we're going to see colonies now in Africa, and we're going to see indirect control of areas in China and Latin America. This is going to be driven by what's known as social Darwinism. Social Darwinism is an ideology, and it's based on the beliefs of Darwin, evolution, the survival of the fittest. Social Darwinism is an ideology that applied these ideas of the survival of the fittest to a nation. This was used to justify the massive expansion of Western empires for the survival of state and to bring the benefits of civilizations for those who are not Westernized. The N stands for nationalism and modernization. So starting about 1850, people began to realize that really the best means to promote their individuality, to promote rights and their self-determination was to be very loyal and unify with people who shared a common culture, a common language, and a common history. This is what nationalism is. So those nations that were Western were very nationalistic. I would die for my nation. But you're beginning to see a lot of the ethnicities, such as those in Latin America, those in other areas of the world, that are going to begin to look to strengthen their own selves through modernization to be able to survive. Remember, this is the age of the survival of the fittest. And to survive and be fit, you needed to modernize. Well, modernization simply means that they adopt Western political systems, Western culture, and they industrialize. And these things promoted survival. Some nations were very successful at this. Some, like China, were not. And lastly, the G, global trade and migration that connects the world. Due to the demand for resources and the need for larger markets, the global network became wider, deeper, and more consistent. And it's going to be made up of two main players. You have on one side the producers. These are the industrialized nations who had enlightened governments, powerful armies, and essentially made lots of goods. Then we have the providers. These were weaker, more traditional states, the old land empires, who had resources in large populations, but were not powerful and could serve as markets. This New World network allowed for the mass migration of people between nations for both economic and political reasons. So there you have it. The modern age is defined as an age not only because of the idea of modern and the idea of an empiric worldview, but also the West is rising. The West is rising to take over through revolutionary ideas, industrialization, coming up with solutions to the problems, exploiting the environment, creating imperial industrial empires, promoting nationalism and modernization to control global trade, and provide for global migration. So, why do historians define 1750 to 1900? We identify the main ideas. Modernization in the empiric worldview. People were seeking to make more modern stuff and stuff that makes sense to what they observed. 1750 is the start because of both the start of the Enlightenment and industrialization. 1850 is a transition because this is when it begins to really spread to the world. And by 1900, the West controls the world. And the Rising basically defines this as a period. So now that you're done, you can go back through, listen to this again, take some better notes. But when you feel ready and using those notes, please move on to the assessment.